March 17th, 1968. Elvis Presley was hiding. Not from fans, not from reporters, not from photographers waiting outside another hotel. He was hiding from himself. Because despite having everything the world said a man should want, money, fame, mansions, screaming crowds, and a name known across the planet, there was one terrifying question he could no longer silence. What if the thing that made him special was gone? What if somewhere between the sold-out concerts, the Hollywood contracts, and the endless applause, he had lost the very reason he started singing in the first place? And before that Sunday was over, a forgotten child in a forgotten church would force him to face that question. The answer would leave him in tears. The morning began before sunrise. The roads were empty. The sky was still dark. A cold mist hovered above the Mississippi countryside as Elvis drove alone through the sleeping South. No security, no entourage, no manager. Just him. The silence inside the car felt strange, almost uncomfortable. For years, his life had been filled with noise, phones ringing, people talking, executives making demands, fans screaming his name. Somewhere along the way, silence had become unfamiliar. Now it was the only thing he wanted. The dashboard clock glowed softly in the darkness. 4:47 a.m. Elvis hadn't slept much. Again. Lately, sleep came in fragments. An hour here, 2 hours there. Then the thoughts returned. The same thoughts, the same doubts, the same emptiness. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Outside the window, lonely fields stretched into the horizon. Inside the car, memories stalked him. He remembered being a skinny boy in Tupelo, a poor kid with worn shoes and impossible dreams. Back then, music wasn't business. Music wasn't pressure. Music wasn't expectation. It was survival. It was hope. It was joy. He remembered standing beside his mother in tiny churches, where the wooden floors creaked beneath every step. He remembered gospel harmonies floating through warm summer air. He remembered feeling something powerful move through him when people sang together. Something bigger than talent. Something bigger than performance. Something sacred. When had that feeling disappeared? The question haunted him. Maybe it hadn't disappeared all at once. Maybe it had happened slowly. A little piece at a time. One contract, one movie, one performance, one expectation, one compromise. Until one day he woke up and realized he couldn't remember the last time he had truly felt connected to a song. The realization hurt. Because if music was no longer real, then who was he? The highway stretched endlessly ahead. The sun slowly began climbing above the horizon. Golden light spilled across the countryside. Normally, Elvis loved mornings. Today, the beauty barely registered. His mind was elsewhere. Months earlier, he had stood before thousands of cheering fans. The crowd had gone wild. People cried. People screamed. People fainted. By every measure imaginable, it was a triumph. Yet when the show ended and he stood alone in his dressing room, he felt absolutely nothing. That memory still disturbed him. How could a man stand in front of thousands of people and feel completely disconnected? How could someone receive endless admiration and still feel empty? The questions followed him everywhere, and lately they were becoming impossible to ignore. The road curved through a stretch of old oak trees. Spanish moss hung from their branches like gray curtains. The landscape looked almost frozen in time. For a brief moment, Elvis forgot about schedules and obligations, forgot about Hollywood, forgot about contracts, forgot about being Elvis Presley. He simply drove and drove and drove, searching for something he couldn't name. Then it happened. A sound. At first it was barely noticeable, a distant vibration carried by the wind. Elvis frowned. His foot eased off the accelerator. There it was again.
Singing. He turned down the radio immediately. The voices became clearer, rich, powerful, alive. Not polished voices, not trained voices. Real voices. The kind that reached inside a person and grabbed hold of their soul. A chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, every nerve in his body felt awake. He rolled down the window. The singing drifted across the morning air. Beautiful harmonies rose and fell together. The sound carried emotion so pure it almost hurt. Something deep inside him reacted instantly. The feeling was impossible to describe. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't sadness. It was recognition. Like hearing a language he had forgotten he knew. His heart began beating faster. Without fully realizing why, he turned onto a narrow dirt road. Dust rose behind the car. The singing grew stronger. The farther he drove, the harder it became to ignore the strange pull drawing him forward. Then he saw it. A small white church hidden among ancient trees. Simple, weathered, forgotten by almost everyone except the people who worshipped there. The building wasn't impressive. Paint peeled from the wooden walls. The front steps leaned slightly. The roof showed signs of age. But the voices pouring from inside possessed more power than every luxury venue Elvis had ever performed in. He parked beneath a large oak tree. For several moments he didn't move. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. The singing continued. And suddenly his eyes began burning. Why? He wasn't sure. Maybe because something inside him recognized authenticity. Maybe because he had spent so long surrounded by artificiality that genuine faith felt shocking. Maybe because the sound reminded him of his mother. His throat tightened. He swallowed hard. The voices rose higher. A woman sang a lead line. The congregation answered. The harmonies wrapped around each other like waves. No microphones, no spotlights, no producers. No audience, just belief. Raw belief. And somehow that made it more powerful than any concert he had ever witnessed. Elvis slowly stepped out of the car. The morning air felt cool against his skin. He stood listening. Something inside him whispered, "This is why you came." He walked toward the church. Each step felt strangely significant, as though he were approaching something he had been searching for much longer than a single morning. Through the open windows he could see the congregation, around 40 people, families, grandparents, children, neighbors, friends. Their clothes were simple, but carefully prepared for Sunday worship. Every face reflected sincerity. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was performing. They were simply there, present, together. The sight hit Elvis harder than expected, because he couldn't remember the last time he had entered a room where nobody wanted something from him. His stomach tightened. A sudden uncertainty appeared. Should he go inside? Would he interrupt the service? Would his presence change the atmosphere? He stopped near the doorway. For the first time all morning, doubt won. Maybe he should leave.
Maybe this wasn't his place. Maybe... A tiny hand slipped into his. Elvis looked down. An 8-year-old boy stood beside him. The child couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall. His shirt had been ironed carefully. His shoes showed signs of wear. His smile, however, was unforgettable, warm, honest, fearless. The boy looked directly into Elvis's eyes. No recognition, no excitement, no shock. To him, Elvis Presley was simply another stranger standing outside a church. Nothing more, nothing less. The boy squeezed his hand gently. Then he spoke 4 simple words. 4 words that hit Elvis harder than any standing ovation ever had. "Come inside, sir." No questions, no judgment, no suspicion. Just welcome. Pure welcome. And in that instant, something cracked inside Elvis Presley. Not dramatically, not visibly,
but deep within the parts of himself he had hidden from the world. Because he couldn't remember the last time someone had welcomed him without wanting anything in return. The boy smiled again, then began leading him toward the sanctuary. Elvis followed, almost instinctively, as though refusing would mean walking away from something important, something life-changing. Neither of them knew it yet. But before that service ended, the child holding Elvis's hand was about to remind the king of rock and roll of a truth he had spent years forgetting. And that truth would change everything. But deep within the parts of himself he had hidden from the world. Because he couldn't remember the last time someone had welcomed him without wanting anything in return. The boy smiled again, then began leading him toward the sanctuary. Elvis followed, almost instinctively, as though refusing would mean walking away from something important, something life-changing. Neither of them knew it yet. But before that service ended, the child holding Elvis's hand was about to remind the king of rock and roll of a truth he had spent years forgetting. And that truth would change everything. The moment Elvis stepped inside the church, the sound hit him differently. Outside it had been beautiful. Inside, it was overwhelming. The walls seemed too small to contain the emotion pouring from every corner of the sanctuary. Voices rose toward the ceiling like a living thing. Not perfect voices, not professional voices, honest voices. And somehow that made them impossible to ignore. The little boy guided Elvis toward an empty spot near the back pew. Then he sat beside him as though nothing unusual had happened, as though bringing strangers into church was the most natural thing in the world. Elvis lowered himself onto the worn wooden bench. The wood creaked softly beneath his weight. Nobody stared. Nobody pointed. Nobody whispered. A few people glanced at him politely before returning their attention to the service. That alone felt almost surreal. For years, entering any room had created a reaction. People gasped, crowds formed, conversations stopped, the air changed. But not here. Here, nobody cared who he was, and for reasons he couldn't explain, that realization felt like medicine. For the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the burden of being Elvis Presley. He was simply another soul sitting in a church, listening. The congregation continued singing. The elderly woman at the piano played with remarkable feeling. Her fingers moved slowly across worn keys. The instrument wasn't perfectly tuned. Several notes sounded slightly off, yet somehow it made the music even more beautiful. Every imperfection felt human, real, alive. Elvis found himself staring at the old piano. He thought about the expensive instruments in recording studios, the engineers, the technicians,
the endless attempts to create perfection. Yet this old piano carried something those expensive rooms often lacked: heart. The final notes faded. The congregation slowly settled into their seats. A gentle silence filled the room. Then the pastor stepped forward. He was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes. His suit was simple. His voice was calm, but there was strength beneath his words. The kind of strength built through hardship, the kind that couldn't be bought. The pastor opened a Bible that looked decades old. The leather cover was worn from use, pages yellowed by time. Yet when he spoke, every person in the room listened, not because they had to, because they wanted to. Elvis noticed that immediately. Respect wasn't being demanded here. It was earned. The pastor spoke about perseverance, about carrying burdens, about people who felt lost, people who believed they had wandered too far from themselves to ever find their way back. Each sentence landed harder than the last. Elvis shifted uncomfortably. The message felt directed straight at him. Of course, that was impossible. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew what he had been struggling with. Yet somehow every word seemed aimed directly at the doubts haunting him. His chest tightened. The pastor continued. "Sometimes," he said softly, "God allows us to lose our way so we'll remember what home feels like." The room grew quiet. Even the children stopped moving. Elvis stared at the floor. The words cut deep, because lately he had been wondering the same thing. Had he lost his way? Had success carried him so far from his beginnings that he no longer recognized himself? The thought terrified him. The pastor closed his Bible, then smiled warmly. "Before we finish today, does anyone feel led to share a testimony or a song?" Several hands rose immediately. A woman stood first. She spoke about surviving illness, about faith carrying her through fear. Tears filled her eyes as she spoke. When she finished, half the congregation was crying with her. Next came an elderly man. His back was bent, his voice trembled, yet when he began singing, the room transformed. The song wasn't technically impressive. There were missed notes, broken phrases, imperfections everywhere, but every word carried decades of experience, decades of suffering, decades of faith. When he finished, silence lingered. Nobody rushed to speak. The congregation simply absorbed what they had heard. Elvis felt his throat tighten. In Hollywood, performances were judged by perfection. Here, they were judged by truth, and truth was winning. One by one, others stood. A mother sang while holding her daughter. A young couple shared a testimony. An elderly woman spoke about gratitude despite hardship. Every story carried emotional weight. Every song felt genuine. And with each passing minute, Elvis felt another layer of armor falling away. The armor fame had forced him to build, the armor that protected him, the armor that isolated him, the armor that had slowly become a prison. Then something happened. The little boy sitting beside him suddenly stood, the same boy who had welcomed him inside, the same boy who still had no idea who he was. The pastor smiled immediately. "Well now," he said warmly, "looks like Samuel has something for us today." A few members of the congregation smiled knowingly. Clearly, they had seen this before. Samuel walked toward the front of the church. No nervousness, no hesitation, no fear, just quiet confidence. His shoes tapped softly against the wooden floor. The sanctuary fell silent. The boy reached the front, then turned toward the congregation. For a moment, he seemed impossibly small standing there alone. Just a child, nothing more. Yet something about him commanded attention. The pastor nodded. "What would you like to share, Samuel?" The boy smiled. "I'd like to sing." The congregation answered with gentle encouragement. "Go ahead, child. Bless us, Samuel. We're listening." Samuel closed his eyes. The room became completely still. Even the old ceiling fan seemed quieter. Then he began. The first note left his mouth, and Elvis froze. A strange sensation shot through his body. Not because the voice was powerful. It wasn't.
Not because it was polished. It wasn't. Not because it was extraordinary in any technical sense. It wasn't. Yet somehow it was one of the most beautiful sounds Elvis had ever heard. Because there wasn't a single ounce of performance in it. Not one. Samuel wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to sound good. He wasn't trying to be admired. He was simply singing. Completely. Honestly. Fearlessly. As though nobody was watching. As though only God could hear him. The purity was almost shocking. Elvis felt something stir deep inside his chest, something long buried, something forgotten. The boy's voice floated gently through the church, soft, clear, filled with innocence. The lyrics spoke of grace, mercy, protection, hope. Words Elvis had sung countless times throughout his life. Yet suddenly they sounded different, because Samuel believed every word, not intellectually, not theoretically, completely. The conviction in that small voice was undeniable. And for the first time in years, Elvis wasn't listening as a performer. He was listening as a man. The song continued. The congregation sat motionless. Several people quietly wiped tears from their faces. An elderly woman bowed her head. The pastor closed his eyes. Nobody wanted the moment to end, and neither did Elvis, because something extraordinary was happening. The boy wasn't entertaining the room. He was healing it. One note at a time. Then it hit him, hard. A realization so sudden it almost stole his breath. Samuel possessed the very thing Elvis feared he had lost. Purity. Not vocal purity, spiritual purity. The ability to sing without ego. Without ambition, without calculation, without thinking about audiences, without worrying about success. Just truth. Raw truth. The realization hurt, because Elvis remembered having that once, long ago, before the fame, before the pressure. Before the world turned him into a symbol, before music became a business. His vision blurred. He blinked. Too late. A tear rolled down his cheek. Then another. He didn't wipe them away. Around him, nobody seemed embarrassed by emotion. People cried openly here. People felt things here. People weren't afraid of vulnerability. And for the first time in years, neither was he.
Samuel reached the final verse. His small voice trembled slightly, not from fear, from feeling. Every word landed with astonishing force. Then came the final note. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. For several seconds, nobody even breathed. The moment was too sacred, too fragile, too beautiful. And, sitting in the back pew, tears running down his face, Elvis Presley realized something that terrified him. The child standing at the front of that church had just shown him everything he had been searching for. But what would happen next would shock the entire congregation. Because in just a few moments, Samuel would ask Elvis a simple question. A question that would change the course of the day forever. The silence after Samuel finished singing felt almost supernatural. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The final note seemed to linger in the air long after it had faded. For a brief moment, the little church felt suspended between heaven and earth. Then a few quiet voices whispered, "Amen. Bless that child. Thank you, Lord." Samuel opened his eyes. A shy smile appeared on his face. Not pride, not excitement, just simple happiness. The kind that comes from giving something genuine. Then he turned and began walking back toward his seat, back toward Elvis, back toward the stranger whose life had just been shaken in ways he couldn't yet understand. As Samuel sat down beside him, Elvis stared at the boy. His heart was pounding. His chest felt tight. Years of buried emotions were colliding inside him. And before he could stop himself, he stood up. The sudden movement startled even him. Then his hands came together. Clap, clap, clap. The applause echoed through the church, strong, genuine, unrestrained. The congregation looked toward him with mild surprise. Applause wasn't usually part of the service, but nobody seemed offended, because they could see the tears in the stranger's eyes. They could see the gratitude written across his face. Soon, a few others joined in. Then more. Samuel looked confused, embarrassed, but he smiled. Elvis kept clapping, because in all his years on earth, after all the stadiums and awards and standing ovations, he honestly couldn't remember hearing anything more beautiful. Eventually, the applause faded. The room settled again. Samuel looked up at Elvis. "Thank you, sir." Elvis swallowed hard. His voice barely worked. "No, son." He shook his head. "Thank you." Samuel tilted his head curiously. The innocence in his eyes was almost painful. "Do you sing too?" The question hit Elvis like a bolt of lightning. Several people nearby smiled. To them, it was an ordinary question. To Elvis, it felt monumental, because he suddenly realized something. The boy wasn't asking Elvis Presley. He wasn't asking the king of rock and roll. He wasn't asking a celebrity. He was asking a man. A simple question. "Do you sing?" For a moment, Elvis couldn't answer. Then he nodded. "A little." Samuel's eyes lit up. "You should sing something." A few people nearby chuckled softly. The pastor looked toward the stranger sitting in the back. "Brother, if you'd like to share a song, we'd be honored." Elvis felt his stomach tighten. A strange nervousness washed over him, which made absolutely no sense. He had performed before crowds larger than entire cities. He had sung before millions. Yet suddenly, standing in front of 40 people felt terrifying. Why? Because these people didn't want entertainment. They wanted truth. And truth was far harder to give. For several seconds he remained frozen. Then Samuel reached over and grabbed his hand, the same way he had outside, the same gentle confidence, the same kindness, and quietly said, "You're not a stranger anymore." Something inside Elvis broke. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough. Enough for light to finally get through. Slowly, he stood. The church watched with warm curiosity. No expectations, no pressure, just acceptance. Elvis walked toward the front. Every step felt strangely emotional. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet. The old piano sat quietly nearby. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. Dust particles floated in golden beams of light. The entire scene felt frozen in time. The pastor smiled. "What was your name again, brother?" Elvis looked around the room, at the families, the children, the elderly faces, the people who had welcomed him without question, without knowing who he was, without caring. He took a deep breath. "My name is Elvis." A few heads tilted slightly. The name sounded familiar, but nobody reacted dramatically. Most simply nodded. The pastor extended his hand. "Well, Elvis, we're glad you're here." 4 simple words.
Yet they landed harder than any compliment he had received in years. "We're glad you're here. Not because of what you can do, not because of who you are, just because you're here." Elvis felt emotion rising again. He turned toward the congregation, then toward Samuel. The boy smiled encouragingly, and suddenly Elvis knew exactly what song he wanted to sing. The same song Samuel had just sung. No orchestra, no band, no spotlight, no production. Just the song, just the truth, just the heart. He closed his eyes and began. The first note emerged softly, almost fragile, almost hesitant, as though he were rediscovering his own voice. Not the voice the world knew, his real voice, the one buried beneath years of expectation. The church became completely silent. Every person listened. And as Elvis continued, something extraordinary happened. The walls he'd spent years building began collapsing. The pressure, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the fear, the emptiness. Everything poured into the song. Every lyric carried weight. Every word carried pain. Every note carried longing. He wasn't performing. For the first time in years, he was praying. The realization overwhelmed him. Halfway through the hymn, his voice cracked. Not from lack of skill, from emotion. His mother flashed through his mind. Her smile, her faith. Her voice singing gospel songs when he was just a boy. For a moment he was back in Tupelo, back before fame, back before the world knew his name, back when music belonged to his soul instead of his career. Tears streamed down his face.
He didn't hide them, couldn't hide them, didn't want to. And somehow, the imperfections made the song even stronger. The congregation felt it too. Many began crying. Others bowed their heads. The pastor closed his eyes. The old pianist quietly joined him. Soft chords filled the sanctuary. The hymn grew, not louder, deeper. And when Elvis finally sang the last line, the room fell completely silent. Again.
But this silence felt different. Full. Sacred. Healing. Then the pastor walked forward. Without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around Elvis. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like years. Finally, the pastor spoke quietly. "You've been carrying something heavy, haven't you, brother?" Elvis couldn't answer, because the pastor was right, absolutely right. For years, he had carried fame, success, pressure, expectations, loneliness, regret. And somewhere along the way, the weight had become unbearable. The pastor gently squeezed his shoulder. "Leave some of it here." That was all. 3 words. Leave some of it here. Elvis broke completely. Tears flowed freely. Not the controlled tears of public appearances, not the tears people expected. Real tears, deep tears, the kind that come when a soul finally stops pretending. The congregation gathered around him. Nobody asked questions. Nobody demanded explanations. Nobody treated him like a celebrity. They simply prayed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elvis felt peace. Real peace. The service ended nearly an hour later. People slowly began leaving. Children laughed outside. Families gathered beneath the trees. The church buzzed with quiet joy. Elvis slipped outside, hoping to leave unnoticed. But before reaching his car, he heard small footsteps running behind him. "Sir!" He turned. Samuel, of course. The boy stopped in front of him, breathing hard. "Are you leaving?" Elvis smiled. "I suppose I am." Samuel looked disappointed. "I liked your singing." Those words meant more than any award, more than any chart ranking, more than any headline, because they were honest. Elvis knelt so they were eye level. "Samuel, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Have you ever heard of Elvis Presley?" The boy frowned thoughtfully. Several seconds passed. Then he shook his head. "No, sir." Elvis laughed. A genuine laugh. Perhaps the most genuine laugh he'd had all year. "No? No, sir." "Should I have?" The innocence of the question nearly brought tears back. Because in that moment, Samuel saw exactly what everyone else had forgotten. Not a legend, not a star, just a man. Elvis smiled softly. "No, son." He shook his head. "No, you shouldn't." Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out every dollar he had, folded bills, hundreds of dollars, a small fortune for the church. He placed it carefully into Samuel's hands. The boy's eyes widened. "Sir." "This isn't for you." Samuel looked confused. "It's for the church." "That's a lot of money." Elvis nodded. "Not compared to what you gave me." The boy stared at him, not fully understanding. So Elvis placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke the words that would remain with Samuel forever. "Promise me something."
I promise. Keep singing exactly the way you sang today. Samuel listened carefully. Don't let anyone change it. The boy nodded. Okay. Don't let anybody turn it into a performance. Another nod. Okay. Don't sing for applause. Samuel smiled. I don't. Elvis smiled back. I know. Then he added quietly, sing for the truth. Samuel extended his small hand. I promise. Elvis shook it. A handshake between a king and a child, yet somehow they stood as equals. One had fame, the other had purity, and each needed something from the other. Minutes later, Elvis climbed into his car. The engine started. The church grew smaller in the mirror. Samuel stood waving beneath the oak trees. Elvis waved back, then drove away. The road stretched endlessly ahead. But something was different now. The weight was gone. Not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe again. Enough to remember. Enough to feel alive. Behind him, the church members gathered around Samuel after discovering the donation. Questions filled the air. Who was the stranger? Why had he given so much? Then Samuel spoke. He said his name was Elvis. An elderly woman froze. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face.
Elvis? The church grew quiet. Elvis Presley? Samuel shrugged. I don't know. The woman covered her mouth. Oh, Lord. A stunned silence swept through the congregation. Then excitement exploded. They couldn't believe it. The most famous entertainer in America had worshipped beside them, sat among them, sang with them, cried with them, and nobody had known. But years later, that wouldn't be the part people remembered most. The miracle wasn't that Elvis Presley had entered their church. The miracle was why. Because on that Sunday morning, one of the most famous men in history arrived searching for something fame couldn't buy, and an 8-year-old boy gave it to him. A reminder, a truth, a gift. That real music isn't found in stadiums. It isn't measured by awards. It isn't built by fame. Real music begins where ego ends. It begins where truth lives. And sometimes, the greatest teacher in the room is the one nobody notices. A child, a song, a moment, a promise, and a forgotten church on a Mississippi road. Elvis arrived looking for music. Instead, he found himself.